Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. I like to refer to myself simply as a teacher by training and a diplomat by accident. Very prolonged accident, but still an accident. Mr. Aki Tuomea, President Under Secretary General Marty Atisari, Moderator Catherine Kulumuni, and the panelists, distinguished panelists, Professor Helen Ranta and Kilpia, Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. Have I left anybody out? I don't think so. I very much want to thank the organizers of this very important conference for inviting me. And I feel it's a great honor and delight to join you all at this very important gathering. And I very much appreciate the opportunity to address the important and timely subject, United Nations peacekeeping operations, trends and lessons learned. I was reflecting as to how does it fit into the theme of this conference and Historians Without Borders. But I guess when you talk about UN peacekeeping operations, it's more about lessons not learned or lessons yet to be learned. It's also appropriate that this session is being hosted by the United Nations Association of Finland. In this presentation, I'll be drawing upon my experience in dealing with conflict resolution and peacekeeping in global arena. First, as the ambassador and permanent representative of Nigeria to the United Nations for almost 10 years, 9 of which I chaired the United Nations Special Committee on Peacekeeping Operations, among others. And secondly, as United Nations Under Secretary General for about 13 years, including heading 2 UN missions, Angola, and the last one, for me at least, Darfur, which is a joint African Union, United Nations peacekeeping operations. Furthermore, I'd like to draw attention to 3 recent reports which are of huge relevance to this subject and also to their main recommendations, which I believe will be very important to highlight in this presentation. They are the report of the High-Level Independent Panel on Peace Operations called HIPPO, HIPPO, which was chaired by Mr. Jose Ramos Horta, the former president of Timor-Leste. Second, the report of the Secretary General on the future of UN peace operations, implementations of the recommendation of HIPPO. That's the High-Level Independent Panel on Peace Operations. And the third is the report of the Independent Commission on Global Security, Justice, and Governance, which was co-chaired by Madeleine Albright, the former United States Secretary of State and former ambassador to the United Nations of the US, and myself. Meanwhile, at the onset, it should be pointed out that the concept of peacekeeping is nowhere mentioned in the UN Charter. You have Chapter 6, which deals Pacific settlement of dispute. You have Chapter 7, that deals with enforcement measures. And so some people call peacekeeping as lying between Chapter 6 and 7, something like Chapter 6.5. But the important thing is that a concept that was not mentioned in the Charter has become a principal tool of the United Nations in trying to maintain international peace and security. At the same time, the concept and conduct of UN peacekeeping have evolved over time. This evolution can be categorized into 3 phases as follows. First, early and traditional peacekeeping in the years after the establishment of the organization. You might call this the baby peacekeeping operations. The second phase is the post-Cold War multi-dimensional peacekeeping following the collapse of the Soviet Union and the escalation of intrastate sectarian conflicts all over the world. And the third phase is where we are now, which requires almost a new generation of peacekeeping, which I call complex peacekeeping, which involve often peace enforcement in the post-1911 UN peacekeeping operations. So let me talk a little bit about the trends in the concept and conduct of UN peacekeeping operations. In 1948, the first peacekeeping mission and the first high-profile mediation efforts were deployed as creative response to interstate conflicts by a young United Nations. These were few and small operations, largely monitoring ceasefires along recognizable borders. Now, almost 70 years later, more than 128,000 women and men serve under the blue flag in almost 40 missions across 4 continents, working to prevent conflict, help mediate peace processes, protect civilians, and sustain fragile peace process. As a matter of fact, to appreciate how far we have come, the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, in his remarks at the wreath-laying ceremony honoring fallen peacekeepers at the UN headquarters in New York, just yesterday, he said, and I quote, 10 years ago, when the UN's global deployment surpassed 70,000 military and police, that was described as the surge. But now, according to him, the surge has become the new norm. In fact, we currently have, as he said, 107,000 uniformed peacekeepers, as well as 16,000 civilian personnel serving in about 16 peacekeeping operations. Now, while the UN peacekeeping operations have adapted to changing international political environment and indeed have contributed significantly to the successful resolution of conflicts such as in Namibia, and you have no better person than your former president, Atisari, who headed one of the most successful UN peacekeeping operations in Namibia. Also, successes in Mozambique, Sierra Leone, Liberia. There have also been conspicuous failures, such as the mission in Bosnia and UNAMIR in Rwanda. Furthermore, both HIPPO and the Secretary General have observed, and I quote, a worrisome reversal of some of the positive trends and a widely shared concern that changes in conflict may be outpacing the ability of UN peace operations to respond. Moreover, they point out that in the post-Cold War period, a number of peace operations are deployed in an environment where there is little or no peace to keep. And the spread of violent extremism and the scourge of terrorism overlaid into long-simmering local or regional conflicts and the growing aspirations of populations for change, which is placing huge pressure on governments and the international system to respond. Therefore, the strain on the operational capacities at peacekeeping and support system is shown, and the political support is often stretched thin. There is therefore a clear sense of a widening gap between what is being asked of the UN peace operations today and what they are able to deliver. The challenge is to narrow that gap such that, and I quote, the organization's peace operations are able to respond effectively and appropriately to the challenges to come. With the current generation of conflicts proving difficult to resolve, and with new ones emerging, it is essential that UN peace operations, along with regional and other partners, combine their respective comparative advantages and unite their strengths in the service of peace and security. The argument, in my view, is that the UN cannot do everything and should not do everything, but can partner with others who are also stakeholders in peace. And I'll be talking a bit more about one of the biggest partners of the UN in peacekeeping, which is the African Union. Now, since many of the complex UN peacekeeping operations today is in Africa, and conflicts in the continent now dominate UN Security Council agenda. Incidentally, I wonder if all African conflicts on the agenda of the Security Council are resolved. I think the Security Council will be extremely boring. There were very little to do, because more than 60% of their time is spent on trying to resolve African conflict. And therefore, because of that, I think it's necessary to discuss the African situation at the UN. In this regard, there's, in some quarters, the erroneous and unfortunate perception, almost a stereotype, of Africans as passive recipients of UN assistance, especially in the peace and security areas of the work of the organization. I do not intend to dispute the view that Africa is at the center of UN efforts in this key aspect of UN Charter. Many lives have been saved thanks to the United Nations action. My contention, however, is that is with the attempt to confine the continent to a beneficiary status. On the contrary, the reality is that Africa's role in the work of the UN is not limited to receiving international assistance. Since joining the United Nations, African nations have made significant contributions to the work of the organization, consistent with the UN Charter on Peace and Security and other areas. For example, African countries continue to provide substantive support to UN peacekeeping across the globe as troop and police contributing countries and in provision of civilian staff. Several African contingents and civilian staff serve in high-risk environments where they live, often in precarious conditions, and several have died. As the former head of the largest United Nations peacekeeping operation in the world, with a predominantly African character, the African Union United Nations mission in Darfur, UNAMID, until July 2012, I have witnessed and spoken about this reality, often with pride, but also with great sadness that this conflict is nowhere near resolution. And when I come to discussing lessons learned or not learned, I think one of the greatest drawback of UN peacekeeping is that they tend to freeze conflict. They don't resolve many conflicts, but their presence tends to freeze solution. We can talk about the ones in the Middle East. We can talk about Cyprus, which is closer to you here in Europe, but also in Darfur, the largest UN peacekeeping operation has not been accompanied by commensurate efforts to actually resolve the underlying root causes of the conflict. Also, I want to draw attention that in Somalia, without the African Union mission in that country called AMISOM, who are boots on the ground in Somalia, it would be impossible to talk of a UN mission without the backbone, which is provided by the Africans. As the former President Obasanjo of Nigeria said at a recent high-level forum on security in Africa in Ethiopia, he quotes, and I agree with him, one of the few times I agree completely with President Obasanjo, although it's very dangerous not to agree with him. Those of you who have met him will testify to this. I quote, by adopting the Constitutive Act of the African Union at the turn of the century, which uniquely shifted from the norm of non-intervention under the defunct OAU Charter to that of non-indifference, Africa became very decisive and proactive in placing itself on the global peace and security agenda. Africa is definitely no longer a spectator in the international security discourse. If anything, the continent is shaping the global security landscape in rather innovative and profoundly different ways from what used to obtain. It is no wonder, therefore, that Africa is increasingly being recognized by its own citizens as well as by the international community as a key player in maintaining global peace and security. Furthermore, Africa has the most developed regional mechanism in the developing world for conflict resolution and peacekeeping. That's perhaps why the United Nations Secretary General says, and I quote, with most United Nations peace operations in Africa, significant African Union peace operations underway, and common mediation efforts across the continent, the African Union is the key regional partner of the UN. I want to restate, the African Union is the key regional partner of the UN. Nonetheless, that cooperation is often very unequal and very ad hoc in nature. So what is needed is really to have a more long-term strategic relationship between the African Union and the United Nations. Now, let me also talk about the lessons learned. Today, I wish to share with the distinguished audience my thoughts on the broad lessons learned in the UN peace operation. There are, in my view, 9 major issues that are of critical importance in this regard. Time will not permit me to go into details of each of these 9 lessons learned, but I hope that my paper can be circulated, and those who want more in-depth information or insight could also look into it. The first lessons learned is that the UN now regards and also treats peacekeeping in the broader context of United Nations peace operation, through which it responds to the Charter's responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. Therefore, UN intervention is about peace. So from prevention to peacekeeping to peace enforcement and also to post-conflict peace building. So we cannot treat peacekeeping operations in isolation from the totality of the United Nations engagement in dealing with resolving conflict throughout the world. Second, the recognition that the UN must embrace the challenge of maintaining contact and credibility with major parties of a conflict in order to have a good chance of resolving them. The big powers have the luxury of not talking to some parties with which they disagree. For example, in the Middle East, the United States regards Hezbollah as a terrorist organization with whom they do not want to really have any relations. But as the UN, we have to talk to everybody, because I think it's fair to say you don't negotiate with your friends, you negotiate with those who have profound disagreement with you. And my view is that how do you want to influence a recalcitrant partner or recalcitrant side in a conflict? How do you, if you don't talk to them? I recall, and I only tell this story very briefly, that when I was Under Secretary General for Political Affairs at the UN and went on a mission to the Middle East and spoke with Hezbollah, the then ambassador of the United States to the UN, John Bolton, who, by the way, hates the UN, asked upon my return, said, Gambari, how can you talk to Hezbollah? Don't you know that this is a terrorist organization? I said, yes, but first, I'm a UN staff, and the Secretary General has approved that I talk to Hezbollah. In any case, my own experience in peacemaking is that the enemies or the antagonists of today could become a partner tomorrow. Look at Yasser Arafat. I told John Bolton, I said, one of your distinguished predecessors, Andrew Young, was fired for daring to talk to Yasser Arafat, but the PLO later on became a principal partner of the US in trying to make peace in the Middle East. Third, I think it's recognition there can be no military solution to most conflict, especially in the post-Cold War era, where there have been far more intrastate rather than interstate conflict, where wars are asymmetrical and where civilian casualties are extremely high, and where displacements of peoples are cases in point. And therefore, it seems to me that we have to do a lot more in trying to address root causes of conflict rather than just freezing conflict and doing peacekeeping. Fourth, justice is an imperative on the pathway to making peace. I believe you cannot have peace without justice, but many times you have to sequence justice in order to have peace. For example, in West Africa, where Charles Taylor, who was really an awful rebel leader, he became president, and it is the combined efforts of the African Union and ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West Africa, that eased him out. But he was allowed to be a partner for peace, even though he committed atrocities, because the imperative of peace was at that time that we deal with him. But now he's in The Hague. So justice still catches up. And so it's not a choice between peace and justice, but having both justice and peace and sequencing them. The fifth is that is the challenge of addressing root causes of conflict. And again, if you take Darfur, where I have enormous experience, having served there for 2 years, 7 months, 5 days, I think about 30 minutes, and you wonder, how can I be so exact? Well, if you live in a fascia, you'll be counting every minute of your stay in that region. Now, we spent, at the height of this mission, we spent $2 billion for peacekeeping. Guess how much I was allowed to spend on addressing some of the root causes of conflict in Darfur, which is water, not enough of it, very poorly distributed, unevenly, unjustly distributed, $4 million. So we are more willing as an international community to spend money on peacekeeping than on really helping to address some of the root causes of conflict. 6, peace operations must be conducted in tandem with peace building. You don't wait until the conflicts are resolved before you begin to put in elements of peace building, trying to reform institutions, trying to address root causes of conflict, trying to address the issue of justice. They have to go hand in hand. 7 is the role of spoilers. The international community, we still have not been able to deal with spoilers in the peace process. For example, again in Darfur, There are some rebel movements that have refused to sign peace agreement, but the international community is not united on what to do about them and to try to apply the kinds of sanctions that will work, because the rebel elements movement tends to have support in the key capitals in the Western world. Eighth, the role of NGOs and civil society in conflict. Now, the NGOs provide enormous relief assistance, humanitarian assistance, which peacekeepers or peacekeeping operations cannot do. They don't have the budget for it. But the problem is that NGOs tend to be part of the solution in terms of providing relief, but also part of the problem, because NGOs want a mediator like me to take sides. But there's no way in which you can take sides at the same time as to try to resolve conflict. Ninth and finally, I've observed that in peace negotiations and conflict resolution, the parties are able to stand their respective grounds more strongly while also developing a common ground. So your task as a peacemaker, as head of peacekeeping operation, the peacemaking aspect of your job, in my view, is to try to find that common ground. Because if you can define and find a common ground, then parties can feel comfortable in standing their ground. As President Marty Atisari put it elegantly, much more elegantly. He always puts it much more elegantly than myself. He put it elegantly yesterday morning that the most successful mediation and conflict resolution are those that promise a better future for everyone. So that's a common ground, to promote a better future for everyone. In other words, in terms of an inclusive peace operations. Let me, in the 5 minutes that I believe I have left, talk about the future of UN peace operations. Now, HIPPO, the high-level independent peace operations that I referred to earlier, made some overarching and key recommendations which deserve our collective consideration and support. I just mentioned a few of them. First, that politics must drive the design and implementation of peace operations. Many times, peacekeeping operations are designed by the Department of Peacekeeping Operations. In fact, they start it. But it's not satisfactory because it doesn't always put politics and mediation at the center of peace. That has to change. Second, the full spectrum of UN peace operations must be used more flexibly to respond to changing needs on the ground. In other words, it's about the field, it's about on the ground, it's about coordination of all the UN agencies in the field. Many times I've experienced something different from the goal of the UN Secretary General when he says all UN specialized agencies and funds and programs should deliver as one. Because the people who are on the ground cannot distinguish between political mission, peacekeeping, UNICEF, UN. They want the UN, they need help. And so there's need to deliver as one. But the problem is that many times the UN, because itself a family on the ground, it's a very dysfunctional family. And so the challenge of really delivering as one is real. The third is that a stronger, more inclusive peace and security partnership are needed for the future. And the United Nations Secretariat must become more field-focused, and United Nations peace operations must be more people-oriented. So field-focused, people-oriented. I cannot agree with you more, with this conclusion more, and will encourage this distinguished audience to go into further details provided in the report. The role of women in peace operations in conflict areas cannot be overemphasized. There's the resolution, famous 1325 in 2000, but I'm afraid that still the role of women on the ground and who suffers most when there are conflicts, women and children. And yet, we do not involve women as much as we should. There's a lot of lip service put on involving more and more women, but the reality is different. How many United Nations special representatives are women? There are still too few. Now, I have to come to the end of my formal presentation, but I would like to state that in further contributing to the debate on the future of UN peace operation, the Independent Commission on Global Justice and Peace, to which I referred, which I had the honor to co-chair with Madeleine Albright, emphasized the need to create a next generation of UN conflict mediation and peace operations capacity. When I was Under Secretary General for Political Affairs, I was absolutely shocked that there was no mediation support mechanism in that department. When you want to do peacekeeping, you have peacekeepers trained, sometimes standby. When you want to do humanitarian intervention, you have but when you want to do peacemaking, mediation, there's none. You are appointed as a mediator, the Secretary General shakes your hand, you are sent to the field, and good luck to you. We have to do better. I started the peace mediation support unit, and I think it's still very much underdeveloped. So that has to change. We have to also choose heads of UN missions a lot more carefully, and political considerations have to take a lower seat. Furthermore, the Commission recommended that the international community should strengthen the responsibility to protect, and not limit to responsibility to protect, but responsibility to prevent, and responsibility to rebuild. So in conclusion, I would like to say that Jose Ramos-Horta, chairman of the UN High-Level Independent Panel on Peace Operations, prefaced his report with the sad observation that we, the international community, have failed the people of South Sudan. Despite the courageous efforts of some, we have, as an international community, fallen short and continue to fall short in Burundi, in Iraq, in Libya, in Palestine, in Syria, and Ukraine, among others. Nonetheless, it is my view that the full and timely implementation by the stakeholders of the recommendations by this HIPPO and the Secretary General's own response to them and the Independent Commission on Global Justice that I have mentioned, I think the UN operations will be better conceived, better implemented, and will contribute significantly to enhancing the international peace and security. Finally, I want to go back to the preamble of the UN Charter. It says, and I quote, "We, the peoples of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which are brought untold sorrows to mankind." So the emphasis is we on the peoples, and it's on prevention. But in order for prevention to work, in order for peacekeeping to work, we must not leave all the efforts to government. The regional organizations have to be involved, continental organizations such as African Union has to do even more, and all of us have to do even more to really address the challenges that is facing us. The link between peace and justice has grown in importance. We have to address the root causes of conflict, becomes more imperative, and peace building, recovery, and reconstruction, having become part and parcel of consolidating peace, individuals, professionals such as the Finland Institute of International Relations, all of us gathered here, NGOs, we all have to redouble our efforts towards building and enhancing the mechanism for peaceful resolution of wars and violent conflicts. I thank you very much for listening.